It was a bright Monday morning, and James Carter was on his way to a business meeting in the heart of the city. Dressed in a crisp navy blue suit, polished shoes, and carrying a sleek black briefcase, James moved with purpose. He had worked hard to build his career, and today's meeting could open doors to a significant partnership. On the way, James stopped at a bustling cafe to grab a cup of coffee. As he waited for his order, he noticed people around him chatting, typing on laptops, and reading newspapers. James felt calm and focused, going over the points he would present at the meeting in his mind. Across the street, Officer Ryan was on patrol. Ryan, a veteran cop, was known for being overly suspicious and sometimes crossing the line. As he scanned the area, his eyes locked on James. Something about James's confident demeanor and the expensive briefcase caught Ryan's attention. In his mind, Ryan decided James looked out of place. Ryan crossed the street and entered the cafe. He walked straight to James, who was sipping his coffee and checking his phone. "Excuse me, sir," Ryan said, his tone firm but not aggressive. "Mind if I ask what you're doing here?" James looked up, slightly confused. "I'm just grabbing coffee before heading to a meeting," he replied politely. Ryan narrowed his eyes. "What kind of meeting?" he asked, his tone sharper now. James raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry, but is there a reason for these questions? I'm just minding my own business." Ryan's suspicion grew. Carrying a briefcase like that, what's in it? James stiffened but kept his composure. "That's personal, officer. I'm not obligated to share the contents of my briefcase." The cafe had grown quieter as people began to notice the interaction. A few customers exchanged glances, and one or two discreetly started recording the scene on their phones. Ryan frowned. "Well, I need to check that briefcase. We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area." James stood his ground. "I respect law enforcement, officer, but unless you have a warrant or a legitimate reason, I don't believe you have the right to search my belongings." The tension in the cafe thickened. A woman sitting nearby muttered, "He hasn't done anything wrong," while another man shook his head, murmuring, "Here we go again." Ryan's frustration boiled over. "Hand over the briefcase, sir. I'm not going to ask again." James looked directly at Ryan, his voice calm but firm. "No, officer. This is an illegal request, and I will not comply." The room was silent now, all eyes on the confrontation. James's heart was pounding, but he knew he couldn't back down. Little did he know, the events about to unfold would change both their lives forever. The cafe was completely silent, the tension thick as Officer Ryan stood glaring at James. James remained calm on the outside, but inside, his heart was racing. He knew his rights, but the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. "Sir, I'm asking one last time," Ryan said, his voice rising. "Hand over the briefcase, or I'll have to take it." James met his gaze firmly. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. You have no probable cause to search my belongings. If you insist, you'll be breaking the law." A murmur rippled through the cafe. More people had started recording, their phones pointed discreetly toward the confrontation. James could feel their eyes on him. And while he appreciated the silent support, it didn't make the situation any easier. Ryan's frustration boiled over. "You think you're above the law?" he snapped. Without waiting for an answer, he reached for the briefcase. James stepped back, holding it tightly. "This is my personal property," he said firmly. "What you're doing is illegal." Ryan ignored him, grabbing the briefcase and yanking it out of James's hand. The room collectively gasped. A woman near the counter stood up, her voice sharp. "He didn't do anything. You can't just take his stuff like that." Ryan shot her a warning look. "Ma'am, stay out of this." The crowd didn't back down. A man by the window called out, "We're all watching, officer. You better think twice." Ryan's face reddened, but he continued. He placed the briefcase on a nearby table, fumbling with the lock. James stepped forward, his voice calm but loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're making a mistake, officer. Whatever happens next is on you." Ryan ignored him, finally snapping the briefcase open. He looked inside, expecting to find something incriminating. A weapon, stolen goods, or anything to justify his actions. What he saw instead made him freeze. The contents of the briefcase were neatly organized files, all stamped with the logos of major law firms and corporations. Among the documents was a sealed envelope marked QONFIDENTIL, Police Department Investigation. Ryan's eyes widened as he realized what he was holding. James folded his arms, his voice steady but cutting. "That file you're holding. It's part of an active investigation into corruption within the police department, including your name, officer." The cafe erupted. Gasps, whispers, and the sound of more phones recording filled the room. Ryan's hands trembled as he tried to process what he had just done. James leaned closer, his voice low but firm. "You just made this much worse for yourself." Ryan's composure cracked. He slammed the briefcase shut, glaring at James. "You're coming with me," he barked, grabbing James's arm. James didn't resist. "By all means, officer, but this isn't going to end the way you think it will." As they walked out, the crowd followed, recording every step. James knew the truth was about to come out, and there was no turning back. The police station was quiet when Officer Ryan marched James inside, briefcase in hand. The other officers glanced up, surprised by the scene. James, calm and composed, walked with dignity, even as Ryan's grip on his arm tightened unnecessarily. "Sit him down," Ryan barked, pointing to a chair in the corner of the station. He placed the briefcase on the desk in front of him, still shaken by what he'd seen inside. His mind raced, trying to figure out how to control the situation. James sat calmly, folding his hands in his lap. "Officer Ryan," he said evenly, "I suggest you think carefully about your next steps. What you've already done is highly illegal." Ryan ignored him, opening the briefcase again and pulling out the confidential file. His eyes scanned the top page, and his face turned pale. The document detailed an ongoing investigation into corruption within the police department, an investigation that included Ryan himself. The evidence was damning, listing incidents of misconduct, falsified reports, and misuse of authority. Other officers gathered around, curious about what was happening. One of them, a younger cop named Officer Daniels, frowned as he saw the document. "What's that, Ryan?" "None of your business," Ryan snapped, quickly closing the file. But it was too late. Daniels had already caught a glimpse of the words "internal investigation" and the police department's official seal. James leaned back in his chair, his voice calm but firm. "It's very much everyone's business, officer. That file contains evidence of corruption within this department, and it's been submitted to federal authorities. Your name, Ryan, is all over it." A murmur spread through the room. Daniel stepped forward, his expression serious. "Is this true? Ryan, what's going on?" Ryan glared at James, his frustration boiling over. "He's lying. He planted this to make me look bad." James raised an eyebrow. "You took my briefcase without permission and opened it in front of multiple witnesses. Do you really think anyone will believe that story?" Daniels crossed his arms, his voice steady. "Ryan, if this is an internal investigation, we need to notify the captain. Now." Ryan hesitated, clearly panicking. He turned to Daniels, his voice low and desperate. "Don't do this. I can handle it." Daniels shook his head. "You've already crossed the line, Ryan. This isn't about you anymore. It's about the department." Within minutes, the captain was called in. He entered the room with a stern expression, taking in the tense scene. "What's going on here?" he demanded. James stood, meeting the captain's gaze. "Your officer illegally detained me and opened my briefcase without cause. What he found inside is evidence that's part of an ongoing federal investigation into corruption, including his actions." The captain's face darkened as he turned to Ryan. "Is this true?" Ryan stammered, unable to form a coherent response. The captain sighed heavily, motioning for another officer. "Take him to the back. I'll deal with this." As Ryan was escorted away, James felt a surge of relief. The truth was finally out. As Officer Ryan was led to the back of the station, the room buzzed with whispers. James remained seated, calm but resolute, as the captain turned his attention to him. "Mr. Carter," the captain said, his tone serious, "can you explain exactly what happened?" James nodded. "I was minding my business at a cafe, preparing for a meeting. Officer Ryan approached me without cause, questioned me aggressively, and then forcibly took my briefcase despite my refusal. He opened it in front of witnesses, revealing highly confidential documents related to a federal investigation into corruption in your department. Now here we are." The captain's jaw tightened as he listened. "Do you have any proof of this interaction?" James gestured toward the briefcase. "The documents themselves are proof, and several bystanders recorded the incident. I'm sure you'll find those videos circulating online by now." The captain turned to Officer Daniels, who had been quietly observing. "Daniels, check social media and gather any footage of the incident. We need to verify what happened." Daniels nodded and stepped out of the room. Meanwhile, the captain sat across from James, his expression unreadable. "I apologize for Officer Ryan's behavior," he said. "If what you're saying is true, we'll ensure proper action is taken." James leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "With all due respect, Captain, this is bigger than an apology. What Ryan did was not only unprofessional but illegal. And as you'll see from those documents, this isn't just about him. It's about the culture within this department." Just then, Daniels returned with his phone in hand. "Captain, the videos are already going viral. It's all over social media. People recorded everything, from the cafe to Ryan opening the briefcase. There's no denying what happened." The captain sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't good," he muttered. He looked at James, his tone more respectful now. "Mr. Carter, I assure you we will investigate this thoroughly. Ryan will be held accountable for his actions." James stood, adjusting his suit jacket. "Thank you, Captain. But this doesn't stop here. I'm working with federal investigators to expose systemic corruption. I suggest you cooperate fully. It's the only way to rebuild trust in your department." The captain nodded solemnly. "Understood." As James prepared to leave, several officers watched him with a mix of respect and unease. Daniel stepped forward, his voice quiet. "Mr. Carter, I'm sorry for what happened. Not all of us are like Ryan." James gave a small nod. "I hope that's true, officer, because the people in this city deserve better." Outside the station, a crowd had gathered. Reporters, protesters, and curious onlookers. James walked out with his head held high, cameras flashing as reporters shouted questions. He didn't answer, but his presence alone sent a powerful message. As he got into his car and drove away, James felt a sense of relief. The truth was out, and the fight for justice was gaining momentum. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, it felt like progress was being made. The next morning, James sat in his office, sipping his coffee and watching the news unfold on his laptop. Every major outlet had picked up the story. Videos of Officer Ryan's illegal actions were circulating everywhere, sparking outrage across the country. Social media was buzzing with hashtags like #JusticeForJames and #EndCorruption. James's phone buzzed. It was a call from Agent Williams, the federal investigator leading the case against the corrupt officers in the department. "James," the agent said, his tone firm but appreciative, "what you did yesterday was brave. The attention this case is getting now is exactly what we needed to move forward." James leaned back in his chair. "I didn't plan for this to happen. I was just standing up for myself. But if it helps bring change, then I'm glad." Agent Williams explained that the videos, combined with the documents in James's briefcase, had strengthened their case significantly. "We've already identified several officers involved in the corruption ring," Williams said. Ryan's actions gave us the final push to take this public. Meanwhile, at the police station, the atmosphere was tense. The captain had called an emergency meeting with his officers. "This department is under scrutiny like never before," he said, his voice grave. "Anyone who's been involved in misconduct needs to come forward now. If you don't, we'll find you anyway." Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Ryan, suspended and under investigation, was already facing charges. But the captain knew there were others involved, officers who had either looked the other way or participated in unethical practices. Officer Daniels, who had witnessed Ryan's actions and seen the fallout, stepped up after the meeting. He approached the captain privately. "Sir, I've been noticing things for a while now. Strange behavior, missing evidence, falsified reports. I didn't think I could say anything before, but after what happened with James Carter, I can't stay silent." The captain nodded. "Thank you, Daniels. Your honesty will help us clean this up." As the department began its internal review, the federal investigation ramped up. More officers were identified, and subpoenas were issued for key witnesses. The city's mayor publicly announced support for the investigation, promising full cooperation and pledging reforms to restore public trust. Back at his office, James received a call from a local civil rights organization. They wanted him to speak at an upcoming rally for police accountability. At first, James hesitated. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and the past few days had been overwhelming. But then he thought about what was at stake, not just for himself, but for countless others who had experienced similar injustices. He agreed, knowing his voice could make a difference. That evening, James prepared his speech, reflecting on everything that had happened. He felt the weight of responsibility, but also a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about creating a system where everyone could feel safe and respected. As he finished writing, James looked out the window at the city lights. The road ahead was long, but he was ready to face it head-on. The rally was held in the heart of the city, where hundreds of people gathered in a park, holding signs and chanting for justice. The energy was electric, a mix of frustration, hope, and determination. James stood behind the stage, looking out at the crowd. He felt a mix of nerves and purpose. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the countless others who had faced similar injustices. As the MC introduced him, James took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The crowd erupted into applause, their support giving him strength. He stood at the podium, adjusting the microphone, and began to speak. "Good evening," James started, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I didn't expect to be standing here today. A few days ago, I was just a man on his way to work, carrying a briefcase filled with documents. But what happened to me, what Officer Ryan did, wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much bigger problem." The crowd nodded, murmurs of agreement rippling through the audience. "For far too long," James continued, "people in our community have been treated unfairly. We've been profiled, harassed, and silenced. But not anymore. What happened to me may have been unjust, but it shined a light on a broken system. And now, that light is too bright to ignore." The crowd cheered, their voices rising in solidarity. James went on to talk about the importance of accountability, sharing how the federal investigation was uncovering deep corruption within the police department. He thanked the community for their support and urged them to keep fighting for change. "This isn't just about one officer or one department," he said. "It's about creating a future where every person, no matter their race or background, can feel safe and respected. It's about standing together and demanding better." When James finished speaking, the crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing across the park. People chanted his name, their energy reinvigorating his sense of purpose. After the rally, people came up to James, shaking his hand and sharing their own stories of injustice. Many thanked him for his courage, saying his actions had inspired them to speak out too. Meanwhile, the investigation was gaining even more momentum. Several officers had come forward, exposing the corrupt practices they had witnessed. Officer Daniels, in particular, became a key witness, providing critical information that strengthened the case. The city's mayor announced new reforms, including the creation of an independent oversight committee to monitor police conduct. Training programs were also introduced to address bias and ensure accountability. As James walked back to his car after the rally, he felt a sense of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. The journey wasn't over, but progress was being made. The voices of the people were being heard, and the system was beginning to change. James looked up at the night sky, stars shining brightly above. He knew there was still work to be done, but for the first time, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, community members, and activists filled every seat, eagerly awaiting the verdict. James sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap. He had spent months working with federal investigators, attending meetings, and sharing his story. Now it was all coming to a head. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. After a long trial, it was time to announce the outcome. Officer Ryan had been charged with multiple offenses, including misconduct and violating James's civil rights. The investigation had also exposed a web of corruption in the department, leading to charges against several other officers. The judge's voice rang clear. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, the court finds Officer Ryan guilty on all counts. A collective sigh of relief spread through the room, followed by applause from the crowd. James closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Justice had been served, not just for him, but for everyone who had been wronged. As Ryan was led out of the courtroom, James stood and turned to face the people who had supported him. Their smiles and applause reminded him of how far they had come together. Outside the courthouse, a large crowd had gathered, holding signs that read "Justice won" and "Change is here." James stepped onto the steps, where a podium had been set up. Cameras flashed as he approached the microphone. "This is not just a victory for me," James began, his voice strong and steady. "This is a victory for all of us. It shows that when we stand together, we can hold people accountable and demand the justice we deserve." The crowd erupted into cheers. James continued, "But this is only the beginning. The fight for equality and fairness isn't over. We need to keep pushing for reforms, for accountability, and for a system that works for everyone." As he spoke, James felt a sense of purpose. The pain and frustration of the past months had transformed into a drive to create lasting change. Over the next few weeks, the impact of the trial became clear. The police department underwent significant reforms, including new training programs, stricter oversight, and a commitment to transparency. Community leaders and law enforcement began working together to rebuild trust, holding regular meetings to address concerns. James also took on a new role as an advocate for justice, speaking at schools, events, and organizations about his experience. His story inspired others to share their own and fight for change in their communities. At home, James found moments of peace. He could finally focus on his work and spend time with his family without the cloud of the incident hanging over him. Yet, he never forgot the lessons he had learned. One evening, as James walked through the park where the rally had been held, he paused to watch the sunset. A group of children played nearby, laughing and carefree. He smiled, feeling hopeful for the future. Justice had been served, but the journey wasn't just about one man. It was about creating a world where everyone could feel safe, valued, and respected. And James knew the fight would continue. But this time, with more voices, more allies, and a brighter vision for what was possible. Months had passed since the trial, and the impact of James's fight for justice could be felt far and wide. The once troubled police department was now under new leadership, with a focus on rebuilding trust and creating a culture of accountability. James had become a symbol of resilience and courage, his story inspiring others to challenge injustices in their own lives. One day, James received an invitation to speak at a national summit on police reform and community justice. Leaders, activists, and policymakers from across the country were gathering to discuss ways to create lasting change. James was hesitant at first. He didn't see himself as a public figure, but the thought of making a difference pushed him to accept. At the summit, James stood before a large audience, his voice steady as he shared his journey. "My story is just one of many," he said, "but it shows that even in the face of injustice, we have the power to stand up and demand better. Change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight, but when we come together, we can build a better world." His speech was met with a standing ovation. Afterward, people approached him with gratitude and encouragement. Some shared their own stories, while others asked for advice on how to create similar reforms in their communities. James felt both humbled and inspired. Back in his city, James worked with local leaders to create programs that bridged the gap between law enforcement and the community. One initiative, called Bridging the Gap, brought officers and residents together to discuss issues, share experiences, and build understanding. Another program focused on mentoring young people, teaching them about their rights and how to engage with authority responsibly. James also spent time visiting schools, where he encouraged students to dream big and stand up for what they believed in. "Your voice matters," he told them. "No matter how young or small you feel, you have the power to make a difference." Despite his new responsibilities, James never lost sight of what mattered most: his family. He made it a priority to spend quality time with them, cherishing the quiet moments that reminded him of why he had fought so hard in the first place. One evening, as James sat on the porch with his wife and kids, he reflected on everything they had been through. The challenges, the fear, the victories, they had all shaped him into the person he was today. And while the journey had been difficult, it had also been meaningful. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, James felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead would always have its challenges, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone. He had his family, his community, and a newfound purpose to guide him. His fight for justice wasn't just about the past. It was about the future, a future where fairness, respect, and hope could thrive for everyone.